Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sandy Quinn. I'm president of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and I welcome you to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Thank you for coming. I want to tell you that we are coming to you live. Those of you who are watching us on live stream, YouTube, we're coming to you from the East Room at the Richard Nixon Library. This is an exact replica of the very room at the White House that's now used for state functions, banquets, press conferences, and other important meetings involving heads of state and others. And it's one of the features here at the Richard Nixon Library in Yorba Linda. And starting Friday, this Friday, we will present the Richard Nixon Centennial Exhibit. This is Richard Nixon's 100th birthday year, and to mark that, we have a 4,100 square foot exhibit talking about, in video and big photographs and interesting artifacts and documents and letters, we're talking about the pillars of the Richard Nixon legacy. It'll be up all year this year, 2013. We hope if you live in Southern California or if you're visiting that you'll come by and see it and say hello. Tonight's speaker, you all know, you know of him. He's a decorated combat veteran, a Marine. In 1980, from 1983 to 86, he was the counterterrorism coordinator for the National Security Council. He has written 11 books. We have hosted him, I think, 4 times here. He's a great patriot. We welcome him every time, as we do tonight. Please welcome Colonel Oliver North.
Supposed to stand at attention when that is played. Sandy, thank you for your kind words of introduction. I'm particularly glad to be here this evening with you because 2 things. Number 1, Fox News gave me the option of being in Kandahar, and I'd much rather be here, or being at the State of the Union address, which I am terribly sorry to have taken you from. It is great to be back with friends in the place that has always treated me kindly. As some of you know, I came to have a close relationship with the president for whom this library is named, and I want to share some of those stories with you this evening and then talk about some other current events. I first met President Nixon in 1984 when President Reagan convened what came to be called the National Bipartisan Commission on Central America, or more informally, the Kissinger Commission. One of the things that President Reagan had wanted was that every former living president would testify before the commission and give their recommendations as to the course of America's policy towards Central America in particular and Latin America in general. I was given the assignment of contacting each of the former presidents, Carter, Ford, and Nixon, and arranging their schedules in such that they could testify before the commission at a special room at the State Department. Not quite as nice as the East Room, but very opulent indeed. Each one of those former presidents had their own way of doing things. President Carter said he didn't need any information from the NSC, he had his own sources. He didn't get anything from the NSA. President Ford said I called him up when he was at a ski place out in Colorado. He said, bring with you a laptop, when we had just gotten the first laptops ever invented, and we'll write it on the way back. Maybe you ought to bring a draft. And I did, of what he would say before the commission, which was very supportive of President Reagan's policies, which were to support the movements of freedom and democracy throughout the region and contend with the Sandinista communist government in Managua, which was intent on spreading a revolution without frontiers, their term for what they called the Sandinista Rebellion. They had come to power in 1979, and things had gone to hell in a handbasket, to put it mildly, in Latin America and in Central America particularly, supported not just by the Soviet Union, but by the Bulgarians, the East Germans, the Cubans. All of that, of course, disappeared once the Soviet Empire collapsed. With Richard Nixon, it was different. I called President Nixon when he was in Teaneck, New Jersey. John Taylor, who some of you know was his secretary at the time, and he said, the president's going to want to talk to you personally about what it is he needs. I called back at the appointed time from my desk at the National Security Council staff, and President Nixon said, well, I want everything. And he told me exactly what it was that he was insisting on having, most of which was very highly classified, but it was internal documents about the situation in Central America from the CIA, the Department of State, Department of Defense, the Treasury, and others who had involvement in what was going on down there, to include recent decrypts, as they put it, at the National Security Agency. All of this required that there be a safe repository for it in Teaneck, New Jersey. We arranged for 4 safes to be sent from the White House in a truck, delivered to Teaneck, New Jersey, and an inventory control agent who would make sure that the documents were properly handled once they got to Teaneck. I started a process that went on for over a month of calling the president when a document was sent, telling him what it would be, and sometimes even including a cover memorandum when it was dealing with a singular subject, but the Department of State, the CIA, the Pentagon had all put their opinions attached to it. On one occasion, the president, having just been called, did you receive the documents? He said, yes, I did. And I want you to know that the CIA analysis is seemingly right on, spot on. Pentagon's a little less so. Who prepared the summary sheet? I very proudly said at that moment, I did, sir. Well, it's a piece of crap. Thank you, sir. I tried to do better over the course of the next several weeks. The first to testify was President Carter. It was set to accommodate his schedule. It was right after we returned from one of our trips to Central America, where Dr. Kissinger shepherded this group of truly bipartisan leaders. I mean, it had Jack Kemp on it, it had Bob Strauss, it had Lane Kirkland, it had Edward Bennett Williams. Those were the kinds of people, tier 1 of America's, if you will, intellectual and political elites. And when we came back from one of the trips, Jimmy Carter said, this is when I want to testify, and so it was arranged for everybody to be there, and President Carter walked in with a habit apparently that President Nixon also had at one point in his life. He had written 38 pages, handwritten on a yellow legal tablet. He sat down in the chair, and I sat behind him in case he needed anything, and watched as a former president of the United States put every member of the commission dead asleep as he flipped one page at a time through his 38 pages, handwritten, about his opinions of what would happen if we didn't follow his policies in Latin America. With Jerry Ford, it was entirely different. A CIA officer and I flew out to Vail, Colorado, picked him up in the airplane. I'd prepared a draft of things that he might want to talk about. He dictated it to me, and I sat in my very poor typing and prepared a draft, double-spaced. We printed it out when we got to the State Department, set it in front of him, and he read it right down to page 4 where I had obviously pushed a button down too hard and there was 4 lines of nothing but the letter R. And he paused for a moment and just flipped the page and continued on. When President Nixon came, it was the day that KAL 007 was shot down. I had arranged very carefully with each of these presidential visits that the Secret Service be aware of it, that there were security arrangements that had to be made. We sent aircraft from the 89th Special Air Mission Unit out in Andrews Air Force Base to pick them up. They sent Gulfstream aircraft to pick them up. Usually one of us would accompany them back. Jimmy Carter refused to be accompanied. He came with one of his friends from Georgia. I came with President Ford, and I met President Nixon at the place he had appointed. He said, "I am not going to take anything from the White House. I don't need anything from the air mission. I'll ride the Eastern Shuttle." And he did. A prop jet, electric, flew down from Newark, New Jersey, regular commercial air service. I told the Secret Service team chief what was happening, and he went nuts. Said, we're just not going to walk him through National Airport. We're just not going to do that. We're going to meet him out there. I said, that's not what he wants. He said, I don't care. We're going to do it my way. So 4 Suburbans pull out on the tarmac at National Airport. We go up the back steps on the jetway. The door opens, and President Nixon steps out and said, "Well, Oliver, fine mess you've made of this." Thank you, sir. If you just step down those stairways, they'll put you in the Suburban and take you. So we got in the Suburban. Actually, we got in the armored car. The Suburban's escorting us, and he says to me, "What has President Reagan said about those bastards who shot that plane down?" I said, "Well, sir, I don't know because it's 8 o'clock in the morning and nothing has been issued as yet. I need to talk to the president." Picked up the phone. White House Communications Agency answers immediately because it's a secure voice communications. I said, "President Nixon needs to talk to President Reagan." Operator says, "Just a moment." I hand the phone to him, and he says, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to know. I don't want to get out in front of you." I don't know what President Reagan said because I could only hear what President Nixon said. All he said at the end of it was, "Thank you, I'll do it." Hung up the phone. We pulled up in front of the State Department. And if you have a chance to go through the new exhibit, and I encourage you to do so, it opens Friday, you will see some of that milieu in which I came to know this great president. Because he stepped out of that car in front of the State Department with dozens of cameras facing him. And he walked up to them, and of course they were all shouting about, what about KAL 007? The plane was shot down, all those people killed. And he said, "Those commie bastards have to pay." I want that tape somewhere. We're going to find that. We went into the hearing room at the State Department, and President Nixon sat down and took off his watch. He did not have a single note with him. He set it down in front of him, and there assembled on the platform were all the members of the commission. He took his watch off and said, "I'm going to speak for 45 minutes, and then I will take 45 minutes of your questions, and then the major will take me back to the airport." And that's exactly what happened. For 45 minutes, and he looked at his watch occasionally, but never at a note, he started at the Rio Grande River and worked his way south all the way to Tierra del Fuego. He knew the name of every head of state, every internal and external political and diplomatic dynamic. He knew the national security situation and the prospects for democracy and free enterprise in each one of those places. And throughout it all, Henry Kissinger sat in the middle of this commission with his arms across his chest, smiling, and never said a word. Afterwards, he took 45 minutes of questions, again without a note. And afterwards, Henry Kissinger said to me, "Well, Oliver, what did you think of the lesson?" It was, and I wrote this in one of my books, the finest tutorial on foreign policy that I have ever heard. It was absolutely magnificent. It was right down the line as to what was needed to bring about the kind of outcomes that would guarantee democracy in that part of the world. And of course, he didn't need a note to do it in. I have come to admire him enormously. The last time I spoke with him while I was still engaged as a Marine was the night after a certain hearing in Washington, D.C. in July of 1987. That night, you have to remember, we had 35 federal agents that we lived with at the time, and our family had an unlisted phone number and guys that carried Uzis in the front yard, and the terrorists who had tried to kill my wife and children had been arrested but then released because they posted bond and disappeared. And so we lived with a lot of guys with guns. We had an unlisted phone number. And at that first night of the hearings, I got 4 phone calls. One from the current President of the United States, one from the Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, because I'd been there in a Marine uniform because he told me to go in a Marine uniform. One from Billy Graham, who I asked, "How did you get my phone number?" And he said, "Well, I just called the White House operator." And the 4th phone call came from Richard Nixon, who obviously got the phone number any way he wanted. And he said to me something that was unforgettable. He said, "Oliver, I watched that hearing today. The story you told was just magnificent. And it had the additional merit of being the truth." I am reminded when I see exhibits like the one that opens Friday that Lyndon Johnson sent my brothers and me off to war, and Richard Nixon brought us home. Richard Nixon came to office campaigning, and I remember it vividly as a young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, getting ready to go to that war, and Richard Nixon promised to end that war the right way. He did everything in his power to make that so. You will see here on the 23rd and 24th of May this year, the 40th anniversary of the return of the prisoners of war that will be celebrated right here in this East Room replica. Richard Nixon tried his mightiest to make sure that that war ended the right way. We hear a lot about ending wars, but his goal was to make sure that the Vietnamese had what they needed to be able to fight the war themselves. It's important to note that the last American combat forces were pulled out of Vietnam in 1972 by agreement with the South Vietnamese government. It wasn't a unilateral decision at all. But the promise was made that we would continue to provide support and training and advice to the Vietnamese, even though our combat troops had left the country. Unfortunately, on December 4th, 1974, with Richard Nixon no longer in office, the Congress of the United States cut off every cent of any kind of aid whatsoever to the South Vietnamese government. The Vietnamese War wasn't lost on the battlefields of Vietnam. It wasn't lost because of Richard Nixon. It was lost because the Congress of the United States did not fulfill its commitment to help the Vietnamese fight an enemy. And as General Giap wrote in his memoirs, he knew that day in December of 1974 that they had won the war, and by the 30th of April the following year, 5 months later, they did. The tragedy of Vietnam is not Richard Nixon's. The triumph of those who fought there is his. And he recognized the extraordinary sacrifice that young Americans had made on that battlefield like few others at the time. One has to remember what the country was like when he came to office in 1969. It was a divided nation. It was fractured. It was nearly broken. There was chaos, literally, in the streets. That chaos didn't begin with Richard Nixon. He'd promised to bring us home. It began with his predecessor, who had failed to fulfill a strategy that would have given us victory. And it ended with the catastrophe of the congressional cutoff in 1974. I raise those issues with you here this evening because my job for Fox News is to cover, for the last 12 years, soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, and Marines fighting another war that looks like it could end the same sad way. I say that to you not to be maudlin, because I'm a chronic optimist One would have to be, given the work that I do for Fox, in 55 embeds in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Philippines, Mesopotamia, literally all over the globe. I've been given the opportunity and the privilege of keeping company with heroes. Most of our American citizens don't know who those heroes are because so few Americans have any connection to our military today. In fact, as the son of the greatest generation, my dad and Richard Nixon fought in the same war, World War II. Tom Brokaw was right. It was the greatest generation. The population of the country at the time was 179 million. There were 16.5 million men and women in uniform. When I came into the Marines at the age of 17 in 1961, there were still over 5 million in the Armed Forces of the United States. By the time I got to Vietnam in 1968 as a second lieutenant, there were 6 million. Today, there's about 1.3 million, and it's about to get smaller. And yet, we've been engaged in 2 theaters of the same war now for a dozen years. Having spent my entire life in and around the armed forces of the United States, the son of a soldier, I look now at what's happening and I say to myself, it can't possibly go the wrong way, but it can. Hopefully, the American people are smarter than most of our politicians today and even my colleagues in the media. I'm frequently asked by my media colleagues if I've learned anything yet. Usually referring to something in the media. Have you learned anything yet? So yeah, I've learned, for example, that both the military and the media take casualties. Now, in the media, the casualty normally occurs when they fall off their ego and land on their IQs, but it's still a casualty. That's a line from my boss, Roger Ailes, who also knew Richard Nixon. Second, we both count on feedback. Now, feedback in the military is very easy to judge. Is the enemy advancing or retreating? And the feedback in the media is a little different. Normally it comes in the form of an email. I brought with me one of the emails I received while I was broadcasting on Hannity some footage, and I'm going to show you a short sample of footage here in a few moments. I was broadcasting some footage. I was standing next to one of the sergeants who'd been on the mission with me, and the feedback came as follows. Colonel North, on Hannity tonight, you said, ground combat's the worst experience a human can have. This is not true. The worst experience a human can have is spending time with my mother-in-law. My best friend spent 2 years in Iraq, did a tour of duty in Afghanistan. He lost his right hand in Fallujah. He's met my mother-in-law. I just called him. He agrees with me. He says it's not even a close call, Jim in San Diego. Helpful feedback. I tell my colleagues my job at Fox News is to keep company with heroes, and I mean it. I know that when I've said the word hero to a youngster, they immediately conjure up the idea of someone wearing a spandex suit and a cape. And then I remind them that a hero is not a fictional character. A hero isn't someone who catches a pass in the end zone or drives home the winning run in a ball game. A hero is a person who puts themselves at risk for the benefit of others. And that certainly characterizes those I cover. Over 2.4 million young Americans have now served in this long war. Fox is going to air some stuff coming up here as part of our celebration of Memorial Day, and we're putting together some B-roll, as we call it, that will be fed up on the network to show the American people just what these youngsters are like. The footage you're about to see is about 1 minute and 50 seconds of B-roll that was shot by me or my cameraman on those 55 embeds. It includes every single U.S. military unit that we've been with over the course of that 11, now almost 12 years of coverage. And I want you to just think of trying, if you could, to summarize 12 years of your life in 1 minute and 45 seconds. Josh? Just a touch. You know, in the media we call each other colleagues, so my colleagues really don't get it. And I'm not just trying to pick on the media, but I love to. You know, yesterday, Army Staff Sergeant Clinton Romeshay, a native Californian, by the way, was presented with a Medal of Honor for gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty during a vicious fight with the Taliban in 2009. I read the coverage this morning of what was in 3 different newspapers as I flew out here. Instead of focusing on this staff sergeant's remarkable courage and tenacity, the media instead highlighted the commander-in-chief's comments on the margins of it. It's not in his citation, but it was in the political context, very political. I quote, "No one should have to defend the indefensible." That's what the commander-in-chief said. In other words, you would never have received this medal if someone else hadn't screwed up. I find that kind of commentary to be rather typical. The media coverage of this war has certainly not been as bad as it was in Vietnam, but it has been less than complimentary. Consider this. They beat Abu Ghraib like a rented mule for the better part of 6 long years. Newsweek invented a story about a Quran being flushed down a toilet at Gitmo, and I was in Iraq when that story came out. I watched the riots as hundreds of people died as a consequence. Americans lost their life over a totally fictional story that was presented by a legitimate news organization as the truth. We had a United States senator describe those who serve in our armed forces as likened to those who'd served Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot in Cambodia. And of course, every crime report today includes some reference to military service of the perpetrator or the suspect in the crime. Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer Prize recipient for the New York Crimes, also writes for the Washington Compost, described those who served in our military, and I quote, as nothing but poor kids from Mississippi, Texas, and Alabama who couldn't get a decent job or health insurance, so they joined the military because that's all we offered them. That's just flat wrong. That kind of denigration of those who volunteered to serve our country ignores the fact that we have today the finest, brightest, best educated, trained, led, and equipped military force the world has ever seen. I want to put up on the screen some photographs. These are shots taken from the thousands of miles of footage that we've shot over the course of the last 12 years. This is the reason why they came. Even the youngster that enlisted last week came because of what happened on 9/11/01. The average age of those enlisting in the service today, and every one of them is a volunteer. By the way, the all-volunteer force was started by Richard Nixon. Those volunteers are today an average age of 20 and a half. They're all high school graduates. They're all, as I say, volunteers, and they are 50% more likely to be married today than they were when I came in as a Marine lieutenant. About half of them have college education when they enlist in the service. Average education in today's military is 13 and a half years, meaning a year and a half post-high school education. The equipment that they use is the most sophisticated weapons and equipment ever designed by the hand and mind of man. They can operate it, use it, maintain it like no one else in the world, and nobody without at least a high school education could even try. They go to work wearing an 8-pound Kevlar helmet, a 45-pound flak jacket, a 50-pound pack on their back, and they can use their weapons like they're part of their bodies, and their bodies like weapons, and they can take a life or save one because they're so remarkably well trained. Over the course of the last 12 years, we've seen a remarkable transformation in the technology that they use. And yet, it's the same young American who's come into the service wanting to serve his country in ways that literally put them at risk while they become the protectors and guardians of Muslim women and children. They have shown an entire culture in Iraq and Afghanistan how to be the right kind of person to women and children, something that is foreign to the culture in many of those places. I look at those youngsters and I say to myself, could I have gotten my 18-year-old son to clean his room, fix his meals, wash his clothes, go to school, get done an entire day's work, and come back after 18 and a half hours and do it all over again without a size 10 in his backside? Never would have happened. That those same youngsters today gather in a prayer circle. And that, by the way, is not going out on a football field. These are youngsters who are bold about their faith. They kneel in prayer, they pray for one another, and they're going into mortal combat against an enemy who intends to die in the process. It's astounding. What they're up against is more like the enemies that my uncles faced in the Pacific theater of World War II than anything my dad faced in Europe. They exhibit all of the qualities that you or I would want in an employee: courage, loyalty, tenacity, adaptability, commitment, responsibility, accountability, and most of all, the vivid exhibit of Christian compassion. This is from frames I shot on the 6th of April, 2003. I was embedded with the 1st Marine Division in Camp Pendleton, California, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, and they're the lead in the attack going to Baghdad. Baghdad is the smoke you can see in the background. The youngster you see in the middle of the frame, and I'm now on a helicopter ramp watching him carrying wounded fighters off the battlefield. This rifle company of 250 Marines, reinforced, has been ambushed by a Republican Guards regiment of about 700 of the best of Saddam Hussein's army. The crossfire is murderous. In the midst of it, a United States Navy medical corpsman rushes out into the beaten zone between the two forces to start picking up wounded fighters off the battlefield. This is the 3rd fighter he's carried off that battlefield. He's already got battle dressings on him. Those are U.S. battle dressings. He has a tourniquet around one leg that this corpsman has put on it. And if you can look carefully at his eyes, he's terrified. But the wounded soldier isn't a U.S. Marine. It's a Republican Guards, yes, enemy soldier, an enemy combatant. He's risked his life to save an enemy soldier. While I'm standing on the ramp with my little camera, a Reuters news crew is rushing up on the side and catches this last of the wounded guys being brought aboard. It's on the right side as you look at the screen. You can't see them, but they're over there. The Reuters news crew watches as he carries the wounded Iraqi out, lays him on the ramp of the helicopter. The wounded soldier is treated just like the wounded Marines, put on a litter, wrapped in a shock blanket, IV started, and the helicopter crew says, "We've got to go." The bird is being hit with enemy fire. The CH-46 helicopter takes off and heads to the field hospital. I'm running behind the corpsman with my camera as I hear the Reuters news crew shout out, "Hey, mate, what did you do that for? Didn't you notice he was an enemy, an Iraqi?" The corpsman looks over and gives what I can only describe in polite company a gesture. Fewer fingers. And shouts back to the Reuters news crew, "Didn't you notice he was wounded? That's what we do. We're Americans." I'm going to wrap up my comments here and then take your questions, but I want to challenge you here this evening. We've now got roughly 2.2 million Americans who've served in this war. Our military is going to be down to something under 1.5 million here, no matter what happens in this sequester and budget fight that's going on with the potentates on the Potomac. Ultimately, it's going to be a tiny military. Over the course of the next year, tens of thousands of young Americans who have served our country in uniform are going to come back and they're going to start looking for jobs. Do you realize that in today's environment, the unemployment rate for those who served in this war is almost double the national average? That, my friends, is unconscionable. That's what happened to those who served in the Vietnam War. And what we did to the veterans of the Vietnam War should never, ever happen again in our country. So, my challenge to you here this evening is the next time you have a job opportunity, do this. You cannot go out because the EEO people and the HR people and all the rest of them will go nuts if you posted a sign that said, veterans only need apply. But there's nothing to stop you from saying veteran wanted because you have a good job opening. I say that to you because, one, I've got skin in the game. The good Lord blessed my best friend and me with 14 lovely grandchildren. I want them to have the same kinds of opportunities that Richard Nixon envisioned when he came to office in 1969. I want them to realize the dream that Ronald Reagan, the president I worked directly for, had when he said that we have a rendezvous with destiny. If we do have that rendezvous with destiny, it will be because we put good Americans who've put blood on their table, who served us selflessly in harm's way, in difficult and dangerous places. And it will only be realized if we can continue to recruit good people to serve in our military. That won't happen unless we treat the veterans right. They have proven that we're the land of the free because we're still the home of the brave. Thank you for having me here tonight.
Your passion is contagious. Thank you, sir. We have our first question right here.
Sir, Joanne Wysocki from the Harbor of Los Angeles. Why do returning veterans have such a hard time getting assistance from the bureaucracy, mainly the federal government?
Yeah. Well, let me, first of all, there's a lot of the federal government that works under the motto of nothing is too good for our troops, and that's just what they'll get. Nothing. And so I'm not surprised. Quite frankly, I don't think it's the responsibility of the federal government to do something for every veteran, but I do think it's the responsibility of the federal government to take care of those who've been wounded, those who've been hurt and cannot go out and find gainful employment as easily as others. In this war, we have 37,000 young Americans who've lost limbs or lost their sight. These are youngsters who in many cases in previous wars would have died. And our next American Heroes book is going to be about them and the triumph of them and their families over the tragedies that have occurred in their lives and the perseverance and tenacity and resilience they have. I do believe it's the responsibility of those of us in the private sector to find work for them that's productive and profitable. I mean, there's no place on the planet Earth where you can find employing your God-given gifts and talents as you could do well, like America. And it's wrong that we don't find private sector opportunities for them. And I think in large part it's because the media has done such a job of demonizing, first of all, the Vietnam vet, and today they've victimized those who've served in this war. I mean, all you have to do is turn on almost any media and find out how thousands and thousands of them are suffering from post-traumatic stress. But, you know, I know the people who treat post-traumatic stress at places like Balboa, the hospital outside of San Diego, at Walter Reed Bethesda back in Washington. And they will tell you that one of the things that affects a person's outlook on life is the outcome of a war. Well, if you don't win the war, dear Lord, why did I lose my legs? And so you can understand why some people are going to be affected adversely by the outcome of this contest that we're in. I don't believe that the American people ought to walk away from them and leave it up to the government. I think the American people ought to go out there and every one of us who's been an entrepreneur or a job creator can go to a VFW or an American Legion or a Marine Corps League, or they can go to a employment office and say, I want veterans for a job that I've created here in the private sector, and it's a good job. And give them the opportunity that other kids who didn't serve, remember, less than 1% of the American population even knows the name of somebody serving today. But you go to a recruiting office and say, I want you to pass the word. Every one of us has got a recruiting office somewhere nearby. Average radius is about 40 miles unless you're in Montana, right? And so go and say, hey, look, I've got some good jobs coming up. Pass the word. Here's my card. And you can do that online. I do not believe that we ought to expect that the federal government's going to do it, because they won't. And quite frankly, we'd be better off if they didn't. Just get out of the way and let the private sector handle it. Yes.
Thank you, Colonel. The next question comes to us from Phoenix, Arizona via online, and it's appearing on the screen. And Colonel, I'll read it to you. President Obama has announced that the U.S. will withdraw 34,000 troops from Afghanistan by 2014. What will be the impact of that decision?
Yeah, now, it depends on how fast they do it. I mean, the bottom line of it, that's nearly all of the troops that we've got there right now. You're going to end up with actually a few more than I thought Obama would agree to. That came from his speech tonight that I'm terribly sorry you all missed. You could have been there on the couch. Look, the end result of this war is going to be determined in Washington, D.C. This is a war that can be won. The word victory has never been uttered since this president came to office. The word win is never used. He constantly talks about ending the war responsibly. If he thinks that we ended the campaign in Iraq responsibly, he is inhaling. I'm very serious about that. The precipitous withdrawal from Iraq has had devastating consequences, not just for us in Mesopotamia. It's having devastating consequences in Syria right now, because the Iranians are now using Iraq as a thoroughfare to ship arms to the most radical factions in trying to hold on to power in Damascus with the al-Assad dynasty. And that would not have happened if we had not withdrawn so quickly. If that happens again in Afghanistan, the outcome will be disastrous. They have a safe haven for the Taliban in neighboring Pakistan. The diplomacy that has accompanied this campaign has been abysmal. The only folks who went to war over there, State Department didn't go, the Department of Transportation didn't go, soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, and Marines went. And you need more than that. You need a diplomatic effort that accompanies it. Otherwise, you could have a disaster. And my hope and my prayer is we don't.
Colonel, a lady from Fullerton in the rear of the room.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. I just want to ask you, the past 4 years have been extremely hard on me. I'm very, very sad over what's happening in this country. Do you ever see a president taking over someday in this country like a Ronald Reagan or a Richard Nixon that might put this country back on its footing?
You sound like my sister. I wrote a book about it. It's called Heroes Proved. And thank you for the plug. This book is actually written in the year 2032. And as I said, I'm a chronic optimist. I think it's possible. I have hopes that the Republican Party does not fragment itself and go into self-destruction. I have hopes that there's the kinds of leaders who will do the right thing for America and have the courage to say so, and the convictions of it, and that people elect them. I have concerns that if we don't find that kind of leader, that what we will have built is this entitlement idea that everybody in America is going to somehow live off the fat of 1.5 or 2% of the top earners in America. And notwithstanding what a California legislator said the other day on Fox News, who shall otherwise remain nameless, Pelosi, there is a spending problem here. You know, I mean, I couldn't run my family the way the government's being run, and you can't run the government for much longer the way it's being run. And so that's going to take real leadership. And real leadership has been absent in Washington for some time now. Do I remain hopeful? Yeah, because I'm an optimist. And I don't know who that's going to be, but I certainly hope it's someone who comes up pretty quickly, because Lord knows we need it.
Colonel, a question from Fullerton, California via the internet, and we'll put it up on the screen and I'll read it to you. How should we deal with North Korea following the nuclear tests yesterday?
Yeah, great question, because the North Koreans are building intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they're building nuclear weapons. There's a little parallel course that you can look at in diplomacy. There's a country called Iran that is using the intercontinental ballistic missiles that are being built in North Korea, and they are building nuclear weapons. There are those in Washington who believe that you can simply have economic sanctions that will work against Iran. Korea is an interesting model. In Korea, grass is a vegetable, okay? There's mass starvation in Korea because of economic sanctions that have been in place for 40 years, okay? Has it stopped them from building nuclear weapons? No. Proof positive yesterday. Has it stopped them from building ballistic missiles? No. Why, if it wouldn't work in North Korea, would it now work in Iran? And somehow or another, we don't have people in Washington asking that. I just returned 5 days ago from the Middle East. During my trip over there, I sat down and talked with people in Jerusalem in the Knesset. Every one of them will say, no matter whether they're very liberal in the 13 parties that they've got in their political process, or very conservative with Likud and Bibi Netanyahu, every one of them will tell you we are united on one issue. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and the only way to stop them is to ensure that everyone there understands that if they do go beyond a certain line in refining uranium, that we will attack them. They know, and we know, and you should know, this is the Israelis talking, that we can damage their ability, but only the United States can destroy it. If indeed this administration is intent on carrying on a, quote, diplomatic sanctions regime and excluding military force from the equation, the Iranians will have a nuclear weapon just like the North Koreans. That, my friends, would be a disaster because they will use it. They've promised to do so, and I know that everyone's tired of all of the comparisons, but if you read what they say, despotic regimes always tell you what they're going to do. Adolf Hitler did it, Joe Stalin did it, Mao Zedong did it. They're telling everybody that if they get a nuclear weapon, they will annihilate Israel. Anybody who thinks that one nuclear weapon going off in Tel Aviv is going to change life as we know it on this planet is also inhaling right along with the people in the Oval Office. It would be a disaster for all of us. There is a way to stop it.
Colonel, a young lady from Laverne, California.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. My question is concerning the media. What occurred that allowed this media to get so out of control? Why aren't they worried about libel or lawsuits or things like that?
Good question. How has the media gotten so out of control? I are the media now. I mean, I find it to be astounding, the awesome power that the media has, it believes it has. Quite frankly, the number of people who read newspapers drops every day. The number of people who watch television news on any source drops every single day. Young people don't even open a newspaper or watch television news. It's all coming off the blogosphere. What you've got, unfortunately, is a perception widely out there that what you can read on the internet is true. I get a call about 3 times a week from my son saying, "Dad, you've got to look at the Google thing." I said, no. Just hit the delete button, son. I mean, the media really is not nearly as powerful as it perceives itself to be. The problem is the attitudes of the American people who don't act on it. Case in point, November last year, while I was overseas, the American people decided they would not bother to go to the polls and change things in Washington. That's not the media's fault. That's our fault.
Colonel, another question from the internet from Hampton, New Jersey. Should, you'll love this, should Chuck Hagel, wait a minute, should Chuck Hagel get confirmed as Secretary of Defense? What will that mean for the U.S. military?
You must have read my column last week at Town Hall. Where is he? I don't think Chuck Hagel would be good for the military. I don't think he'd be good for America. I think his perception of, there was this vicious exchange that occurred during the Senate Armed Services Committee confirmation hearing between Senator Hagel and Senator McCain. I don't know if you saw that. It was on Fox News several times. The issue dealt with what did Hagel mean when he said that the surge in 2007 in Iraq was as big a foreign policy blunder as Vietnam. And everybody focused on the surge part of the question, to include Senator McCain. I wanted to know, and I was watching this overseas. You have to remember, I was overseas watching American media. I wanted to know, what the hell is it about Vietnam that was the blunder? Was it getting in, getting out, not supporting him? I mean, if Hagel comes to the idea that military force is the wrong thing to do, he's in the wrong place. He ought to be the Secretary of Peace instead of the Secretary of Defense.
A young lady from Orange County.
See, nobody here is from Nebraska. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Colonel North, I have a question. First of all, I highly respect you. I have a question. I concur that we have the most sophisticated military, best military in the whole wide world. We have everything that is beyond anybody's wild comprehension. We're fighting these barbarians that live in foxholes, but as a 76-year-old woman, I'm looking at this and saying, I feel like it's a political correct war. We can kill them, but we can't hurt them. What can we do as Americans, other than America has just lowered their standards by not sitting up and voting and getting this country back on track? It scares me. What can we possibly do? Tell us what we should do.
Vote. I mean, there's no doubt that our military is the best in the world. There's no doubt that the soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardsmen, Marines who are serving are the brightest, best educated, trained, led, and equipped. There's no doubt about it. They need leadership, and we don't have it. Okay? We had a chance to find it. We didn't. And the idea is that we're going to somehow solve that with Chuck Hagel as Secretary of Defense. Well, we kind of get what we deserve. Right. Yes.
Colonel, there's one more question we'll take from online from Syracuse, New York. The civil war in Syria has been raging for over 2 years now. What involvement, if any, should the United States have in guiding the outcome?
Well, look, an awful lot of what we talked about tonight is stuff that's water over the dam. Syria is almost water over the dam. I mean, what we ought not to do is what we did with Libya. I mean, everybody's still got questions about what the dickens happened in Benghazi when 4 Americans get brutally killed by people that we were supposedly there to help. The outcome in Syria is very much in doubt. The chaos in Syria, which has resulted in over 60,000 dead, is the direct consequence of America not standing up and doing what it should to support those who would get a better outcome than what we're going to get. Leadership is not... I'm going to have to wrap with this because Sandy's going to lynch me. I'm going to start a whole new conversation here this evening. Look at I've seen great leaders. I've seen abysmal leaders. Nations need leaders. We don't need dictators. We don't need people who tell us what to do. We need people who stand in front and lead. Richard Nixon did that when he campaigned on the promise to bring our boys home with a program he called Vietnamization. That we were going to train the Vietnamese to fight their own war. They could have won. The Congress abandoned them in December of 1974. Everybody wants to blame just one guy sitting in the Oval Office for the current situation. Well, we still have a United States Senate led by the likes of Harry Reid. We still have the same guy in office who called our troops the ones who had likened them to the troops who'd served Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. Now, if that doesn't change because of the American electorate, in America we do it with ballots, not bullets. We have got to motivate our neighbors to get involved in the political process. What will solve the Syria problem isn't getting in late and letting everybody else throw their arms around the most radical parts of that rebellion against the Assad regime. What's needed is sophisticated covert operations. It needs the deliveries of things like communications equipment and arms to those who are going to give us a more tranquil outcome. It's terrifying to the neighbors in Turkey and in Jordan what could happen in Syria. You could end up, without that American leadership, with a devastating outcome for that part of the world. In that part of the world, we have one real ally, and everybody watches what we do with him. The commander-in-chief is about to head out there. He's going to go visit Bibi Netanyahu. He's going to put the arm on Bibi Netanyahu to come up with some kind of peace plan. It won't be the kind of thing that Henry Kissinger used to do with shuttle diplomacy. It's going to be the moral suasion of a man who has been unable to do anything in that part of the world except give the Cairo speech in 2009 that precipitated what they call the Arab Spring. It's not an Arab Spring. God willing, there'll be people smart enough in Israel to say, you know what, we need to take care of ourselves. We are not going to rely on America to pull the plug on us when we have to defend ourselves. I was on the Golan Heights less than a week ago. I looked down from the Golan Heights, 60 kilometers to Damascus. It was down that same road that the Iraqi and Syrian armor came in October of 1973. God forbid that we should do something to our only ally, the only democracy in that part of the world that says you can't defend yourselves. I look at that part of the world, and this all started with Syria, and I say to myself, this is the consequence of a failure to lead. You cannot lead from behind, you have to lead from the front. That's why they call it leading, not pushing. Thank you very much for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree Colonel North can be embedded at the Richard Nixon Library anytime, and we hope he'll be back in November when he launches the next book in his series. This book, however, is now in our gift shop. You can get your copy, and he'll be in the lobby in 1 minute, and he'll inscribe and sign your book. Remember that Father's Day is coming up, some good holidays. It's a great gift. Thank you for coming. Valentine's Day. Good Lord.